Hello. It's been a while, been busy with work and other things, but I'm going to read Hosteen Klah again. It's part 3. It says, it's chapter 8, Boyhood at Nayet Tsayet. The summer of 1867, with drought and a devastating plague of army worms, brought complete despair to the Navajo farmers at the Bosque Redondo. By August, they knew there would be no corn to harvest and no fodder for their sheep and horses. Many of their older people had died, among them a number of the most powerful medicine men, and they had begun to feel that their gods had deserted them. Everyone began to plan some way to leave this unlucky country. Long before word came from Washington granting them a reservation in their home territory, Ziliana and his family had been packing their belongings, manning the 2 wagons, buying new canvas, and selling the weakest of their sheep and goats, since only the strong would be able to make it back to Fort Defiance. Even before the treaty, the government was signed, they were on their move. Asna Sosi and her husband, Hashke Nolier, had sheep and goats, but no wagons, so their household goods were loaded with those of her aunt. Assange Sosi and her foster mother drove 1 4-horse team pulling a canvas-covered wagon, and her aunt and uncle drove the other. Most of them men rode horseback and herd the sheep. Many other Navajo families started with them, some with horses and wagons or burros and mules, but many on foot. They were given a military escort as far as Bear Springs, Fort Wingate, which was then in Navajo territory. Here they were turned over to the Indian agent and were counted in order to receive government rations. Among the trees behind the agency, they made a temporary camp between their wagons, where they waited 4 or 5 weeks for their men to arrive with the sheep. Then they all moved back to a sheltered cove on Bear Mountain and built semi-permanent living quarters in which to stay through the winter. The commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington had sent word that all Navajo families would remain near Fort Wingate until the government could buy a large flock of sheep to be distributed among them. Only a few of the most prosperous Navajo still owned flocks of sheep and goats, and there were no cattle. The agent at the fort issued rations of salt, flour, sugar, coffee, and sometimes fresh beef, but there was never any certainty when these supplies would arrive. And when they did, there was seldom enough for all. So the poorer Navajos were often hungry. October frost had opened the pinon burrs and the pine cones, so the Navajos spent the crisp autumn days gathering nuts to store for the winter. Sunflower seeds, wild millet, cactus fruit, and rose hips were also gathered. In the latter part of October, Sosi gave birth to a baby boy who was destined to become the most noted Navajo medicine man on the Navajo reservation. In preparation for the birth, a small hut had been built at some distance from the cluster of hogans that housed the several families, and to it Sosi went with her aunt, who was a midwife. A bitter tea made from the root of Azet Nod white daisy was brewed for her to drink, since it would cause a quick delivery. Afterwards, she was given several cups of spruce tea. Her uncle, who was a hill chant medicine man, had accompanied the women and chanted prayers over the Sosi and the new baby. As soon as the child was breathing evenly, he was given a sponge bath with a herb infusion, and then was thoroughly greased with melted goat tallow. No clothing had been prepared before his birth, for that would have brought bad luck, but the aunt had a square of soft buckskin which she used for a blanket. The baby was placed on the pallet beside his mother, with the top of his head toward the central fire. If it had been a warm sunny day, the top of his head would have been put in the sunshine, since heat was thought to be necessary for a baby to grow tall and strong like the corn or the sunflower. The Sosi and the baby stayed in the shelter 4 days and 4 nights, being cared for by the aunt and uncle, before Hoshke Nolier was notified that he had a son, and the birth was announced to the rest of the family. If during this time the baby had died, it would have been quietly buried and never have been counted as being alive. On the fifth day, the father came to see it, bringing soft away a wet odd cotton for its bed and two well-tanned kid pelts for the covers. And the weeks passed. The baby was occasionally fed a little mare's milk to build strong bones and teeth to ensure a strong heart. It was given broth from stewed goat's hearts. No name was given at this time, only Aweshke, mean baby boy, which is the name of all Navajo boy babies before they exhibit some characteristics or some unusual mark is discovered on their bodies to suggest a name. The letter is only a nickname. However, for after their naming rights, they are given a ceremonial name, which is considered their personal property and seldom known to anyone outside their immediate family. It was 4 or 5 years after his birth that this boy was given the nickname that remained with him throughout his life. It was noticed that he used his knife or his left hand more readily than his right, so he was called Klah, which means left hand. For 4 or 5 months, this group lived in the mountains near Bear Springs waiting for the government sheep. But when there was no word of their coming, the group decided to move to Fort Defiance, where they might find better pasture. Again, all of their possessions were packed and loaded on the wagons, and they were on the move. With the sheep trailing behind, it was only 60 miles to the fort, but it was a mountainous trail, and they traveled slowly, advancing more than 10 miles each day, stopping wherever the grass was plentiful to allow the sheep to graze. They found many other family groups living in temporary camps all around the fort. There was no room for them, so they turned north and found a valley with a small lake near the foothills of the Tohatchee Mountains, and here they stayed almost a year. It was the winter of 1868-69 when the government sheep finally arrived, and each Navajo man and woman child was given 2. So Klah, at the age of 1 year, became a sheep owner. This did not mean as much to him then as it did the cradle board his father had made for him while they were at this place. 2 straight pine boards, about 5 inches longer than the baby, were laced together in the center, and a small board was laced on the bottom to form a footboard. Then a thin lath of ash was bent across the top, just above where his head would be, to hold the covers away from his face. Smaller side pieces were fastened to the bottom boards, and holes were bored in them so that the buckskin thongs could be threaded through them, and when laced back and forth would hold the baby safely in place. A thick pad of wet cotton and the 2 kid pelts completed Klah's baby bed, which from that time was his own private property and would never be used by another child. A strong leather strap was fastened to the top in a loop that would reach across his mother's chest, enabling her to carry the cradle board on her back. This gave her the use of her hands while carrying the baby, and it was a great convenience when riding horseback. The cradle also kept the baby from crawling into the open fire or coming to harm in other ways. Again, food became a major problem. The government issue of rations was more generous here, but was often late in arriving. The Navajo families could not depend on it. They had brought some corn from the Bosque Redondo and had bought corn and beans from the Puebloans along the way. They parched the corn and ground it with pinon nut meat or with sunflower seeds, which are rich in oil, to make flat cakes that were very good when toasted on hot stones. They used the tart berries of the naltose to boil with goat milk to make cheese. This is the same plant whose freshly root is crushed to make a paste for toothache medicine. Assange's aunt, who had much knowledge of plants and herb medicine, searched the mountains for crow, onions, wild mustard, pepper, grass, beeweed pods, sage, mint, and many other herbs used for healing. With this addition to their rations, they managed to stay strong and well until the arrival of the promised sheep. When every family had received its quota of government goods and sheep, they separated, each clan journeying to its own homeland, as did the Jews returning to Jerusalem in the time of Babylonian captivity. Zephaniah and all of his family continued west of the Hopi country. Astan Sosi, Hushke Nodia, and Baby, both of her brothers and older sister, 2 aunts, and 1 uncle crossed the Cottonwood Pass and came to their old home in Nayet Zayet. Their first hogan was built at a place they called Debebagan. It was near an old sheep kraal and was not far from Debebetwa sheep springs with grass-filled valleys on 2 sides. Government rations were now a thing of the past, and the winter had exhausted their corn and nuts. But it seems that there was always something provided by Providence. During the years of their absence, the few horses that had been abandoned in the canyons had multiplied until wild herds were to be found ranging through every valley and watering at every spring. Ushke Noria and other Navajo men soon built high corrals to capture a few at a time, as they wished to tame the colts for their own use and kill the wildest ones for meat. Some of these horses they traded to the Zuni and the Laguni Indians for corn and beans, and to the Mexican ranchers for goats. Thus their small flocks of sheep were held intact, and in the spring there was a good crop of lambs, which more than doubled their number and gave the Navajos wool for weaving and mutton for feast days. About this time, the Indian office in Washington decided to take a census of all Navajos living on the reservation. To do so, they offered 1 sheep to every Navajo who would come to Fort Defiance to be counted. This census was not a complete success, for many families living at a distance refused to come. Pushkenoye and all of his clan went and received more than 15 sheep. Their flock was now beginning to be of such size that when the autumn harvest had been gathered and stored, they need not look further to another winter of semi-starvation. Klah remembered living at Deshin Dekan in the Cedars, as most of his boyhood was spent there. And at the home near the Black Dyke, he remembered the wide cornfields, which were irrigated twice each year, once before planting time, that when the arroyos overflowed with water from the mountains melting snow, and once in midsummer when seasonal rains filled the irrigation ditches. He told of helping with harvest and storing the corn and beans in pits where they would be safe from wandering bands of Ute or Apaches. And he told of shearing time, which was an outstanding event in the life of any small Navajo boy. When the time came to shear sheep in April or May, a secondary corral was built near the home corral, and a number of expert shearers were engaged to do the shearing. A flock of sheep would be driven into the new corral, and each shearer would take one out and clip its coat. The wool did not come off in bits or bunches, but in one entire fleece, which was tossed to a Navajo packer. Large wool sacks were attached to a frame, and the packer stood inside each in turn to stomp the wool down tight as it came to him, fleece by fleece. The shearers vied with each other in regard to the time required to shear a sheep and the smoothness of the fleece. To clip through a sheep's hide so that there was even 1 drop of blood was a black mark on the shearer's record. The shorn sheep was handed over to another helper who with black tar made the owner's brand new between its ears and shoved it into the larger corral. It was the custom for all families in that era to use the same corral and employ the same shearers, whose pay was a share of the wool. Both men and women helped with the shearing, which required strong arms and backs. The older women baked quantities of oven bread, pan-fried tortillas, and blue corn tamales wrapped in corn husk, then baked under hot ashes. A goat, generally an old one, was killed and roasted in a pit filled with hot coals. It was stuffed with corn leaves, mint, sage, pepper, grass, and wild mustard, then well salted before being placed in the pit. where it was thickly covered with corn leaves and a layer of earth. A steady fire was kept burning on top for half the day. There were big black pots of coffee and kettles of beans cooked with peppers. Women worked, ate, and gossiped. Men toiled, sweated, and feasted. Children ran and played, cried, and laughed, and ate all their mothers and ate all their mothers handed them. Shearing time and planting time were the two spring festivals seasons when all worked together. Perhaps half of the white wool and all of the brown wool was kept at home for weaving. There was a growing demand at the trading post for Navajo blankets, and at the time the Navajos still wore dresses and blankets of their own weaving. The wool to be sold was taken to traders at Fort Defiance or to Mormon traders at Joseph City, where it was exchanged for coffee, sugar, canned fruit, velveteen, calico, farm implements, and other trade goods. This was the last trading the whole family went on these trips would do until they sold their surplus sheep in the fall. It was on one of these trading trips that Klah saw his first white people, and he wondered if they were painted and if the paint would rub off. There was a man with a large head of bushy hair and hair all over his face. This astonished Klah, for none of his family had hair on their faces. There was a woman with yellow hair and blue eyes. He wondered if she could really see with such queer eyes, and then he remembered that coyotes and had yellow eyes and could see in the dark. He decided to like the woman because she gave him 2 sticks of peppermint candy, one for himself and one for his sister, who was hiding behind their mother's full skirt. His mother's aunt and uncle were with them on this trip, and the aunt bought him a pair of boots, the first store where he had ever possessed. He decided that they were much too wonderful to wear, and he would keep them to look at. Since he was very observant and remembered everything he saw, this trip gave him much to think about, and he resolved to go as often as he could to see these white strangers who had so many amazing things in their big stone houses. That fall, his mother and father took him to the Zuni Pueblo to trade a blanket with his mother. His mother had woven for cakes of salt for the sheep and cattle, and for reed baskets filled with salt for their own use. He saw stone houses again, and his first orchard peaches were ripe, and his mother bought a basket of them to take home. Klah bit into one and decided it tastes very good. But he did not like the Zuni people because they had such long bangs hanging over their faces he could hardly see their eyes. He did not care to go there again, although his mother and father went every year to obtain salt and fruit. Klah was a small boy when a government boarding school was built at Grand Junction, Colorado. A school organizer came to Tunisia Valley and asked his parents to send their children to school when the agency wagons came for them. The family, with several children of school age, sent part of them to the school, not so much to have their children educated as to keep them safely away from the Utes. Dudley Jolie was one who went and received a good education, but he decided not to see his parents for 6 years. He returned to marry and live in Tunisia Valley, where he became a well-known medicine man who sang the shooting chant. The Sansosi did not send either Klah or Deshbot to this school, as she had only 2 and needed their help at home. Navajo children begin very early in life to help with such tasks as gathering sticks for the hogan fires, shelling the corn, and keeping the water buckets filled. The Sansosi's aunt and uncle were growing old, but the aunt still did the spinning and dyeing of the yarn and most of the cooking and housework. The uncle helped the Sansosi with the sheep, and Hushkenoye was away trailing horses, for there were now several hundred sheep, and their care was too much for one person. The uncle was a medicine man who sang the Hail chant, and his services were in frequent demand for sick people in different parts of the area. He liked to take Klah with him to these ceremonies since Klah could help him with many small tasks. It was on these occasions that the young boy learned this chant, and he was probably one of the youngest Navajo boys to know a full ceremony. He could direct the sand painting, sing the correct prayer chants, and conduct the rites by the time he was 10 years old, and he may have known more about the herbs and pollens to be used than his uncle. He had often accompanied his aunt, who may have been part Hopi, on her frequent trips to the mountains and creeks to gather herbs, berries, roots, and bark to use for various purposes. She was a learned herbalist and could give a name to almost everything that grew within her range of travel. She had ways of telling which plants were poisonous, which were food for animals or birds, and which could be used by humans for food or medicine. She taught Klah that everything growing had some useful purpose, that even the nightshade, the poison sumac, and the yellow dock could be used for making dye for their blankets. He never forgot her teaching. When Klah was 8 years old and large for his age, he was given the task of caring for the big herd of horses. They now owned horses, had added much to the Navajo economy in his great-grandfather's time, and now they were helping his family gain comfortable prosperity. Hosteen occasionally took Klah with him on his trips to round up the wild mares to be sold to the Mexicans or to the Navajos on the other side of the mountains. Klah's own pony was a sure-footed bay mare that had never run with the wild ones and would come to him when he held out an ear of corn. The horses they were able to catch were always branded by clipping a distinct notch or perhaps two in one ear. This was their own brand, and wherever the horse roamed for pasture or water, they could claim ownership when they wanted it. Some of their sheep and most of their goats were marked in the same manner. 1 week in fall was given over to branding, castrating, and taming wild horses. It was not a festival, as there were no women concerned with it and no great quantities of food were prepared, but it was a very exciting time for the young men and boys. The horses were fat and frisky from the summer of mountain grazing and had entirely forgotten that humans were their masters. It was quite a problem to haze them into the corral and more of a problem to get a rope around any neck. What a thunder of hooves as they circled inside the corral, almost invisible in the cloud of dust that was raised. And what a wild stampede when the ones desired had been roped and the others turned loose. It was a stout-hearted lad who had volunteered to ride one of the wild ones. After the first rope was secured around the horse's neck, it was not so difficult to get another on a hind leg and pull the animal to the corral fence, where the rider was perched, ready to leap on its back. Sans saddled, sans bridled, spurs or whip, when the rider's friend hung on to the lariats with all their strength while he clung to the horse's mane until the animal, half choked and white with lather, would pause and grasp for breath. Then the rider would leap to the ground, climb the corral fence, and be greeted with cheers and admiration. He had ridden his horse to a standstill. This was really more of a stunt of bravado than an actual attempt to tame the horse, but many a young Navajo gained his reputation as horse wrangler in this manner. It was a sunny September morning when a rider came galloping from the north to say that a party of raiding Utes had crossed the San Juan River and reached the Sulphur Springs. All of the Junichi Valley farmers were living around their cornfields, and there were only a few horses anywhere near. The news spread, and everyone gathered in a group to make plans. The old folks and the mothers and babies would take sacks of food and start at once for the first Gray Butte. And after following its one path to the top, they could block the passage with stones so that no one could reach them. Herders would mount the few horses and drive the sheep along behind the old folks and women to obliterate their trail. Then the junipers had been reached. The boys would scatter the sheep far and wide among the bushes and arroyos and immediately ride to the hiding places in the mountains. Klah was one of the boys who herded the sheep. The main group of Navajos would pack everything they could carry on their backs and walked toward the Ute war party, who would probably camp that night in Tuasato Springs. They took time to bury the corn they had been harvested and some of their farm implements. Then they started walking single file, keeping to the low ground and valley. Before morning, they had reached the deep Sandnest Canyon, where they rested while scouts reported the progress of the Utes, who were again headed south, never dreaming that the Navajos were just a couple of miles west of them. As soon as the Utes had ridden far enough away from them to be safe, the Navajos started for the mountains where their winter homes were located and where there were many small caves. When the Utes reached the cornfields, they were angry to find them deserted, no slaves to be captured, no horses to take home, and no Navajos to engage in battle. They found a few sheep, which they killed and roasted, and then had a feast of melons, roasting ears, and mutton. They burned the temporary brush houses and rode their horses over the fields, trampling their crops into the ground. Then they turned and rode back to their own reservation at Ute Mountain. This may have been the last time a large party of Ute raiders ever came as far south as the Chunichi Valley. Okay, that was chapter 8 of Hosteen Klah. That is part 3. So I'll try to read chapter 9 as whenever I can, but I've just been busy. So thank you.